You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Switzerland is often noted for its neutrality, but on the weekend it took a decidedly anti-EU stance. By the narrowest of margins, the Swiss voted in a referendum to impose quotas on immigrants from the European Union. The vote was promoted by the ultra-conservative Swiss People's Party, and it reflects anxiety in the country over net immigration, which has run at 1% of total population for each of the past 7 years. Although not in the EU, Switzerland has been part of its single market, and under Switzerland's version of direct democracy, its government now has 3 years to implement the will of the people, which some say could have considerable knock-on effects on its economy. With opposition to the EU on the rise in Britain, Switzerland's actions are seen by some as a model for the UK's future in Europe. Freedom of movement is the cornerstone of the European Union and its single market. But now a country that abides by its rules has rejected that. Could so-called cherry-picking this issue set a precedent? The Swiss vote could have an impact in Britain, where the Prime Minister David Cameron is seeking to renegotiate the UK's membership of the EU. So what is the wider significance of the Swiss vote, both in the UK and the rest of Europe? Well, to discuss this, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by David Coburn. He's the lead MEP candidate for Scotland. Also here in the studio is Petros Fassoulous, who's chairman of the European Movement. And on the line is Robert Oulds, director of the Bruges Group. A warm welcome to you all, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on The Voice of Russia. First of all, I'll start with you, Petros. The German foreign minister has made the point that the Swiss have damaged themselves with this result. Do you agree with that?
If you consider the extent to which Switzerland trades with the European Union, which is its biggest export market, and the extent to which Swiss companies rely to their access in the European Union single market, I think the economic damage is significant. There's also a significant damage in terms of Switzerland standing in Europe and the world. It sends the wrong message. A country that relies massively on foreign direct investment and, of course, on nationals from other countries who come there and contribute with their talent into the labor pool. It sends a message that Switzerland is closing for business. It's setting itself away from the European mainstream, and unfortunately it's a regressive step that takes us back, not forward.
Robert Oulds, an aggressive step that takes Switzerland back, not forward.
Well, it's Switzerland exerting its national sovereignty and the right to manage its own borders and decide who it wants to live in its own country. The people in Switzerland are sovereign, so should be respected. Unlike an EU country where, of course, the European Commission and the institutions of the European Union tell member states what to do and bind their electorates and governments.
That is not true. Usually the European member states voluntarily sign up to anything that the European Union does. Nobody forces.
If you don't obey, you get beaten by the European Union.
They want to keep governing their own country.
Your response to that, Petros?
As I said, the decisions of the European Union are taken voluntarily among the member states of the European Union in cooperation with the directly elected members of the European Parliament, which come from all member states. The European Union is not an entity in itself. It is a group of 28 sovereign states who come together to pursue their common interests. And one of those interests is creating the single market and giving the right. If I may,
we'll just let Petros finish his point and then we'll come back to you, Robert.
28 member states of the European Union have come together to pursue their common interest and provide for their citizens. One of those provisions is the right of free movement. And anybody who wants to take away a right from the people should first have the ability to explain why they're taking away that fundamental right.
Has that been explained in your view, Robert?
Well, the reason why the Swiss have taken this action is because of the crisis within the EU, which has meant that many people are fleeing the Eurozone in particular to find work, and they want to keep control of their borders. If the Euro didn't exist, if the EU didn't make such a mess of its own economy, then there wouldn't be the economic migrants that are now coming to Switzerland. Many, of course, who no doubt will benefit the Swiss economy and work hard, pay taxes presumably, and of course be a general economic use and be productive within the culture. But of course it's too many people, and just like in Britain, the Swiss people want to control their borders. They have the right to do so because they are not within the European Union. Unfortunately, Britain doesn't have that right. but we should be able to control who comes into this country.
But Robert, I suppose on that particular point, really they do have control over their borders. We're talking about within intra-EU immigration, and a lot of people from within the EU work in Zurich and Geneva and the big financial centres there. They're going to now have to be part of a quota system. That's got to be difficult for the Swiss economy, surely.
Well, that will be a judgment for the Swiss to make. They recently voted in a referendum not to increase the age of when pensions become payable, because, of course, they realised that would actually harm the economy. So the Swiss voters are very canny. They do know what they're doing, and it is their own country, and that should be respected. They have an efficient, direct democracy. They have high living standards. They want to preserve them. They want to keep their country's integrity. Let's respect that.
We should keep in mind how close
Britain's right to govern its own borders.
Well, Britain has
David Coburn.
Britain is trapped in this ridiculous European Union, which we did not vote for in the first place, and the establishment will not let us have a vote to get out of it. Mr. Cameron keeps promising votes on this plebiscite, and he hasn't delivered the last time, and he won't deliver the next time. He tried to put it through Parliament, something that he couldn't actually deliver because no Parliament can bind its successor. Quite frankly, the Swiss have done the right thing for their economy. They've got to protect their health service. They've got to prevent house prices going through the roof. They have to make sure that their ordinary working people are not priced out of the labour market.
But they are. But there's only 35% home ownership in Switzerland, and in terms of that, they have a very mobile workforce, don't they? And a lot of their expertise from a country that is low in resources requires people, not necessarily non-EU immigrants, but just people from within the EU. In fact, people who cross the border every day from France, Italy, and Germany.
1 in 4 in Switzerland now apparently are immigrants,
and that provides a great service to the economy.
Well,
the Swiss People's Party has admitted.
Yes, but the Swiss seem to disagree, and the vast majority of people in the United Kingdom, many of whom are immigrants themselves, also disagree, and they would like the UK to stop mass immigration that's coming in through the European Union, because otherwise they can't get homes, they can't get health service, they can't get jobs.
Just on this point, Petros, do you view this as is this really about a fear of immigration, or is it a dissatisfaction with the European Union? Because clearly, immigration is just one factor. The freedom of movement is just one aspect of EU directives that people within the EU and as well as in the wider economic area have to follow.
I think immigration and the question of EU membership are separate. They are exploited by populist parties who are trying to use people's insecurity, which is fueled by the economic crisis.
The economic crisis created by the European Union. That's not disastrous euro which they have forced on people.
Okay, but just on this point of immigration versus the EU as a whole, do you think that people in Europe are really engaging with the issue of the disadvantages of being in the European Union itself, or is it simply being exploited by parties who say, look, immigration is because of the EU?
I think very important questions are being asked around Europe about how to make the European Union work better for all its citizens. And the majority of people understand the benefits of free movement. We have 2 million Brits living across the EU. They work, they study, they retire in other countries. If that right was removed, those 2 million people will have to come here and find a home.
Well, that's just not correct. Under international law, if someone has executed a right to live in another country by as a result of a treaty, even when that treaty is cancelled, that right still remains. This has been tested before. It's known as vested or executed rights. It's an established principle of international law. British people, once we're out of the EU, they will not be facing some exodus where the 1.8 million people that live within the EU but not in Britain will be forced in some great exodus to come back to the UK.
I suggest you ask British citizens.
Of course, there wouldn't be an immediate exodus of people from Britain, and nor would there one be from
The problem is mass immigration. That's the real problem, because you have vast numbers of people moving from poor countries, which have just come into the European Union, moving to rich countries.
To Switzerland?
Well, yes, to Switzerland, and also to Great Britain and to Germany. And the problem in the United Kingdom is that these people are taking jobs or and lowering wages of the British working.
But they're a self-selecting bunch, aren't they? I mean, presumably, if they go to a country like Switzerland, which speaks 4 languages, they'll have to have a certain education level to survive in Switzerland. They're not They're not going to public funds won't necessarily be made available to them. They will have to find work.
Well, but 1 in 4 we're talking about in Switzerland now. There's a lot of people, and the Swiss do not want
who are not Swiss.
Who are not Swiss.
That doesn't necessarily mean they were not from the EU, though.
Well, they may not be from the EU, but the Swiss have decided they have the right to decide who comes into their country and who works there. And the Swiss have decided enough is enough. And, I'm sorry, I'm a Democrat. The European Union, of course, is not a democracy. The European Union the European Union is a bureaucrat's dream, run by bureaucrats for the benefit of bureaucrats, with no democratic control whatsoever. So the bureaucrats absolutely love it.
Right. And from the UK Independence Party's perspective, I appreciate that your party believes that there is a democratic deficit in Brussels and that there are other aspects of the EU you don't like, the common agricultural policy and subsidies and all that kind of stuff. But is that something that the average voter can actually engage with? They can engage with immigration because it's something they can understand. But all the other stuff which is behind your opposition to the EU, they can't really understand.
Of course they do. If you were a fisherman, yes, of course. If you were a fisherman in the northeast of England, and your fishing grounds are devastated by Spanish trawlers, well, of course you are. We used to have a very good fishing industry in this country. We had a very good fishing industry in Scotland, which has been utterly devastated by being members of the EU. And Geoffrey Rippon and Ted Heath gave away fishing. They just gave it away. They could have argued the point and didn't, and they just opened our waters.
This was back in 1973 when Britain became part of the common market.
When we were supposed to be coming into some sort of economic agreement. This is not an economic agreement. This is setting up a nation state called Europe, which we don't want, and one which is not in any way democratic, is massively corrupt, and is now going into various countries like Cyprus or Greece and talking about looting people's bank accounts. That's a great worry for everybody.
But just getting back to the Swiss vote, the Swiss plebiscite, I mean, my point is really one of, do you think that immigration is really the only proper issue that people can really fully engage with because it appeals to a certain sensibility?
Absolutely not. That's just one issue.
But presumably that, to be fair though, that is the way UKIP are framing the debate.
No, it's not actually, because there are many other things about the European Union we don't like. But making rules and regulations now, they're making rules about trusts. They're making rules about what people can do with their money when they die. Goodness gracious, all sorts of economic rules they're bringing in, which is not in the interests of Great Britain. And people do understand that all these ludicrous rules and regulations...
Which, to be fair, are nothing to do with immigration, though.
Of course, but we don't.
It's all about the democratic deficit, which your party stands against.
We are against the democratic deficit. We're worried about all different aspects of the European Union's policies, from windmills to pensioners. Electricity bills have gone through the roof. All that's an EU directive and policy. Of course it is.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. We're discussing the aftermath of the referendum in Switzerland, capping EU immigration. With me in the studio is David Coburn, MEP candidate for Scotland for the UK Independence Party, Petros Fassoulous, chairman of the European movement in the UK, and on the line is Robert Oulds, director of the Bruges Group. Okay, there's a lot that's been extrapolated there, but just fundamentally about the immigration plebiscite that took place in Switzerland. I'm sure other countries will look at that eagerly, and certainly the result has been welcomed, not just by Nigel Farage of David's party, but of course of other parties in the Netherlands, in France and elsewhere. How do you think Europe will look upon this referendum, and how do you think they will react?
Well, there is an element of negotiation that has to take place between Switzerland and the European Union now about how the relationship will be affected by that outcome. But I don't think there is an issue of challenging the right that EU citizens have to move freely across the European Union. It's part of the EU treaties, it's part of the single market, which is massively beneficial. And the free movement of people actually contributes 25 billion to the EU economy, and it provides great advantages. We currently have millions of jobs around the EU which are not filled. build. It's not that we have too much free movement of people. We don't have enough free movement of people. There are jobs out there, and people move to another country. If I may finish my point.
Petros, just finish your point, and I'll come to you, Robert, in 1 second. Just carry on, Petros.
People move from one country to the other in pursuit of jobs and to fill gaps in the labour market, and they contribute massively. £25 billion is contributed in the UK's GDP because of the free movement of people, and that money goes into building hospitals and providing for our social welfare and the functioning of the NHS. So it's remarkably unfortunate to scapegoat people like that and victimize them and portray them as a burden, where in fact
Greece at the moment because
that kind of inflammatory rhetoric is characteristic of populist parties, but it's not responsible and it doesn't correspond to reality.
They removed a perfectly elected democratic government. They forced them out of power.
They never did. Oh,
yes, they did.
Tell me, when did they do?
Well, the rules and regulations, and they were threatening them with things. They wouldn't bail them out if they didn't do this, they didn't do that.
That's not true. It's like
of course,
show me a piece of paper that says that the Greek government was removed by anybody but its own people.
Well, the European Union, that's what they always do, and they also make people vote and vote.
Show me proof. Well, enough with the UKIP lies about everything. Let's show you that.
Okay, let's move on, gentlemen. Robert, can I just ask you, I mean, you're with the Bruges Group, and you're a Eurosceptic organisation, of course. Do you prioritise your view on immigration over other aspects of the European Union that you don't like?
Immigration is, of course, a major issue. Of course, at the moment, the Bruges Group is focusing on the alternatives to the European Union. The debate for us has really moved on beyond, whether the EU is good or bad. There are, of course, quite a high amount of evidence that shows that the EU is an enormous economic cost. Its own Court of Auditors talks about the corruption. It has never signed off its accounts.
That is a lie. The accounts have been signed for the last 5 years in a row.
That has been the case for nearly 20 years. Now, really, the fact is what we should be looking at is the alternatives to Britain. How can we maintain free access to the EU single market and control immigration? It's a plan that I'm actually working on at this moment in time.
And what do you suggest? What does your group suggest to do? How do you suggest going about that?
Britain should rejoin the European Free Trade Association. Britain should establish a relationship with the EU that's based purely on economic access in terms of selling goods and services to the single market.
Which is exactly what Switzerland has. Exactly.
Yes, it's an enormous benefit to Switzerland. They have their economic links, but they do not have the political control of the European Union telling them what they should be doing.
But on that point, Robert, I mean, presumably with the renegotiation of that, you'd have to renegotiate all the bilateral trade deals, and that will cost Britain money, and it won't have a seat in Brussels to have any kind of say over what goes on.
No, not if we remain in the European Economic Area. Then we would still keep a seat within Brussels. We would still keep in negotiations with the EU, just like Norway, and would have the right to opt out of EU legislation, just like the Norwegians do. They have a voice in Brussels. They have influence over Brussels. The OECD has actually described Norway as a leader in developing EU environmental policy. I don't think the same could be said about Britain being inside the EU, where we have to accept what comes from Brussels. Regardless, we have very little influence. Let's get out the European Union and just have a basis relationship.
I'll tell you something else they're very worried about, Robert. They're very worried that the countries like Norway, Britain and Switzerland and various other countries which might remove themselves from the European Union set up some sort of alternative to the European Union, a much more loosely based cooperative economic area. That would absolutely finish the EU, and the EU needs to be finished. It's not just a question of us leaving. We have to make sure we get rid of the whole rotten edifice.
Now, Petros, the European Commission has already signalled a tough response. It's warned that Switzerland's access to the single market in goods and services could be under threat. Should this be a tough response? How should the European Commission react? Because if it doesn't react tough enough, other countries may take Switzerland's lead, and that could be a problem.
It's the European Commission's responsibility to safeguard the interest of the 28 member states of the European Union. The EU and Switzerland enter into an agreement, and if any part of that agreement is not honoured by the signatory, it has to be reviewed. So I think it's a responsibility of both parties to go away now and consider what the outcome produced. Again, the view presented by UKIP and by Eurosceptic think tanks is a regressive one. They want to go back 40 years ago. The UK rejected the option of having a loose free trade agreement with a couple of peripheral countries, and that's why it applied to join the European Union, because it thought it was better for itself. And
No,
it
we
has
joined
proved
an
that it is
economic
better for
arrangement.
itself.
We did not join a nation state.
I suggest you look at the documents. But if you let me complete my argument, the Norwegian government itself has described the current arrangement the country has with the European Union as unsatisfactory because exactly they don't have the necessary input to the decision-making process.
And they still have to pay money. They still have to pay billions a year.
Make a considerable contribution and adopt all the laws and regulations that govern the single market. And if I may, the UK has enormous influence. The UK has enormous influence within the European Union. It is a leader on a variety of issues, not least financial services, the environment, trade policy, which the UK leads. And if we removed ourselves from the European Union at a moment where it's negotiating the biggest trade deal in the history of mankind with the United States, the UK will find itself excluded from a deal.
That
is just plainly not true. The TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, will apply to the EEA states as well, the members of the European Economic Area, such as Liechtenstein, Iceland and Norway. So again, Petros is actually wrong in what he's
Robert,
saying.
you know exactly what I'm saying.
Explore a wide range of possibilities around the EU and around the world. China and Switzerland have agreed a free trade deal. Iceland has agreed a free trade deal with China. Britain can do the same if it's outside of the EU.
On which terms? Can you negotiate
amount of free trade agreements with other nations around the world if we exit the European Union? That is what is being shown by Switzerland and
how
by
can you negotiate
even Iceland.
As a market of 50, 60 million people with a country like China better than you would? Look at the terms. Look at the terms of the Iceland and Swiss trade deal with China, and also the areas, how limited it is. Being part of the European Union, 500 million customers across Europe gives you much more influence when negotiating with countries like China and the US.
Okay, Petros, you made your point. Robert, you made your...
Switzerland has achieved more in its free trade agreements than the European Union, and they cover a wider range of angles. They include services, whereas EU free trade deals do not.
Okay, Robert, fine.
Blazing the way
I understand. You made your point.
Achieved as a small country outside of the EU. Let's follow them.
But isn't the point, David Coburn, that we are making about free trade and all the kind of periphery of European policy, when ultimately what sparked this discussion is a debate about immigration in Switzerland? And I'm wondering, all those arguments about free trade and all that kind of stuff, how on earth are you going to make that to the people of Britain? And how will they understand it?
Well, I think we're doing a pretty good job of it as it is. I mean, we're getting so many votes in the north of England. We're taking votes from the Labour Party, the Conservative Party. So I think that is an opportunity for British people to have the referendum that Cameron denies them. If they vote UKIP, even if they don't support UKIP's policies, but if they vote UKIP in order to register what they think of this monstrous dictatorship in Europe, which tells us what to do in every aspect of our lives, I think that's their one big opportunity to do that.
So basically, you're a protest party without any real policies. I think
we have many real policies. We're a libertarian party. We have a full range of policies which terrify the Conservative Party, because we have libertarian policies. We don't want a nanny state telling everybody what to do. We want to give people decent, fair taxes, and we want a national health service that exists, which will not exist if we continue to be members of the European Union and we have unlimited European immigration.
Okay, Robert, I mean, presumably you'll be looking closely at this renegotiation with the European Commission, with Switzerland. They're going to have to renegotiate all their bilateral deals. And if those negotiations go badly, that will dent surely your argument, won't it?
No, because Britain is already a member of the European Economic Area, so we can protect Britain's trade in both goods and services with the EU. And that's actually a better arrangement than Switzerland has at the moment, because Switzerland doesn't actually have free access to the EU services market. So Britain can do this just by simply remaining in the European Economic Area, which we're already a member of. So it's quite a simple case of just cancelling our EU membership, rejoining the European.
You really think it's as simple as that, though?
Staying in the EEA, that is the way forward. And of course, all this bluff and bluster from the European Union, that is, of course, typical bullying from them. We see when there's a referendum where the people vote against. EU integration, they're told to vote again. That happened in Ireland on the Nice Treaty, happened again on the Lisbon. They just brought it back, this time under a different name, calling it the Lisbon Treaty, which did exactly the same thing. The EU has contempt for democracy and the people expressing their view. It's time that the people stood up to the EU, and the Swiss are showing the way.
Okay,
Robert,
Petros, the point. I think clearly the
how
point.
long it takes them to force or try to force the Swiss to have another referendum.
Well, and there will be further referendums this year. But I mean, the question, I suppose, the point Robert's making there, and David more broadly, is that it's perfectly okay for Britain to be asking the big question of their country's place in Europe.
And I would be keen to have an informed and honest conversation at local, national, and European elections. I call on all political parties to engage in a constructive debate about Britain's place in the European Union as frequently as possible, whether it is in Westminster or on the doorstep ahead of every elections. And I would like to challenge those that talk about free trade deals and trading with the world, but at the same time, they argue in favor of raising barriers and stopping people from coming in this country. Chinese investors from all over the world are asking themselves, is this a country that is really open if it talks about raising barriers and keeping people outside, whether they are students or whether they are people that want to come here, work and contribute in the economy?
But you must accept there is a degree of antipathy towards the EU over the last couple of years. Certainly we've seen it in various countries in Europe. Austerity measures put on Ireland, on Portugal, on Greece and so on. There is a definite wave, isn't there, of anti-EU feeling?
I would invite you to look at the polling in those countries you just mentioned who remain remarkably pro-European, and it's people who want to remain in the European Union. What they disagree with, let me finish my point. Let me finish.
Let Petros finish his point.
They are locally.
Robert, I'll come back to you. Just let Petros finish his point.
They are locally run campaigns. I happen to come from Greece, and I'm fully aware of the local polling and the figures there, and people in Greece remain very pro-European like they do in Portugal and Ireland. What they protest again is a right-wing or neoliberal, if you want to call it that, economic policy, which is what is prescribed currently. That is part of a democratic system that you can change the government. Right now in the European Union, we have a majority of right-wing governments that, according to their ideology, which I suspect UKIP might be sharing, perhaps even Robert.
UKIP are not right-wing, we're libertarian, completely different.
They have the opportunity to change the governments around the EU and promote a different kind of policy. But people in those countries you mentioned remain very pro-European. One point I need to make is that the EU, I am one of the first people that I'm campaigning for the EU to work better and improve the way the economy operates, and we have gone a long way in getting out of the financial crisis, which, by the way, started on the other side of the Atlantic and from the financial sector.
So you accept the EU is inefficient? You accept that there is money that is being squandered?
I'm not saying that the EU is inefficient. In fact, we have a variety of economies in the European Union which are very successful. Okay. The EU itself is one of the most efficient entities in spending money.
Robert, I know you want to jump in, and I just want to ask you quickly. David Cameron says he insists he wants to renegotiate the terms of Britain's EU membership. Do you believe him? It really depends on whether or not he's re-elected. There's no guarantees on that. Do you sort of believe that he is committed to this debate, or is he simply trying to appease the Eurosceptic parts of his party?
For a long time, he wasn't listening to what the British public was saying. The British people are massively in favour of a referendum on our membership of the European Union. David Cameron has been forced into granting a referendum, so we can applaud him there. Of course, the fact is that he's been forced into it, but his hopes of renegotiating and changing Britain's terms of membership with the EU through staying in are just completely inconceivable. The only way that Britain can have the relationship that it wants with the EU, which is economic links in terms of trade, selling and buying goods and services between each other, is through exiting the European Union, not through asking them to change more than 50 years of integration. That is the way forward, leaving the European Union and looking at what the Swiss and the Norwegians are achieving. And then, of course, we can have a better relationship, possibly even a more harmonious relationship with the European Union.
David, if David Cameron wins a majority, and that's a big if, possibly unlikely, and there is no referendum, what are you going to do? What's your party going to do? Continue to make the argument, I guess.
We will continue to make the argument, but I would hope that we would hold the balance of power in the next election. I mean, that's not an inconceivable thought. We're going to come number one in the European poll. I would hope that, the Liberals seem to have committed Harry-Kiri. They really are out of the running anymore. I don't see Mr. Miliband as a credible Prime Minister, and I don't think many other people do either. And UKIP are taking so much much support from the Labour Party in the north of England, where we're coming second to Labour in some of those big northern seats. I would think that UKIP has a very good chance of holding the balance of power, and we will then be able to push for a referendum.
And you're the lead MEP candidate for Scotland.
I am indeed.
Certainly, George Osborne seems to suggest that Scotland will not be able to be part of the pound. Should Scotland join the euro and be part of Europe if it gets independence, if the referendum goes that way?
Scotland should absolutely not go independent. Scotland should remain in the United Kingdom. It's in the interest of Scots. Everybody has, well, the vast majority of people, at least over 60%, I think, have now come to the firm conclusion that Mr. Salmon's arguments...
Let's say they win the referendum, though. Let's say the referendum tips in their favour. What would happen? Where would Scotland be? What currency should it have, and should it be in the EU?
It's a complete catastrophe. It's very difficult to say. What I can't understand is Mr. Cameron, Mr. Salmond is talking about independence. He's not offering independence. He's offering to take Scotland out of a long-standing alliance, and he's offering them to join the European Union. He will have to accept all that goes with that, including the euro.
And on that slightly diversionary note, I'd just like to finish by thanking my guests, David Coburn from the UK Independence Party, Petros Fassoulous, Chairman of the European Movement in the UK, and Robert Oulds, Director of the Bruges Group. My name is Brandon Cole, and you're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London.